Amen. Wonderful time of prayer and manifestations, guys. That was really good stuff. Lots of wonderful things. I had a couple things I was going to start out with, and for the life of me, right now I can only remember one of them, and that was I was privileged to be in a yesterday there was Anthony Buzzard's annual Atlanta Bible College conference, and Atlanta Bible College is part of the Church of God of the Abrahamic Faith. They believe that, like we do, that when you die, you are dead and you're not alive in heaven. They also, like we do, believe in one God, and that Jesus Christ was a 100% total human being. And in Bill Schlegel's presentation that he made yesterday morning, he brought up something that it had never really coalesced in my mind before, that if Jesus Christ was 100% human and 100% God, but was eternal, then you have a 100% human eternal being. Well, I've always thought of Christ, even with my background, I always thought, when Christ, quote, incarnated, you listen to the teachings when Christ incarnated, which means when he became flesh, that's when the real humanity started. But that can't be where the real humanity started if Jesus Christ's nature never changed. So basically a Trinitarian doctrine, then you have God the Father, you have God the Holy Spirit, and you have Jesus Christ the human being, and you have Jesus Christ the eternal God, wrapped up two natures in one being. And so therefore you have a literally eternal human nature in Christ. Then how in the world can Hebrews say that he was made in all points like we are? He would have always been in all points like we are. And I assure you, you and I would not think about life and the problems we have in life, the challenges we have in life, if we were eternal human beings. And so I don't know why I'd never put that together until yesterday, but I hadn't. And it was like, bing, a light bulb went off and went, yeah, there's another reason for us to continue to teach people, and to make people genuine disciples. That's really important for them to know who they're a disciple of. And we have a great we have an easy way of presenting that. Also, Jerry and I wrote commentary on this, but in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, the faces that I see here, you guys are all familiar with this. In 1 Thessalonians 4, when it's talking about the rapture, and it says, we which are alive will not precede those who are asleep. Now, you and I, well, let's just go there. Let's just take a look. I want to show you this because it wasn't as clear to me as it could have been until Jerry and I translated it earlier this week. So let's go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And in verse 13, now we do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, concerning those who are asleep. You and I know that means dead, so that you do not grieve like the rest of humankind who have no hope. There's people that don't have a hope grieve. There was stuff in the manifestations today that about the hope and how we can look to the Father. Verse 14, for since we believe that Jesus died and was raised, so we believe that through Jesus, God will bring from the grave those who have fallen asleep so that they will be with him. Now, what was going on in Thessalonica, and I'm kind of doing a teaching before my teaching, but this is stuff that that I got clarified this week, so I'm really excited about it, which is why I wanted to share it. So the Thessalonians believed like the other first century believers, and Thessalonians was one of the early churches that Paul started, that Jesus Christ would come back in that generation. In Matthew 24, he said, this generation will not pass until these things are fulfilled. In Matthew 16, he said, there's some of you standing here that won't even die until you see me come in power. He told his apostles, you will not finish evangelizing Israel before you see me come in my kingdom. So the people of that generation were expecting Christ to come back. Well, what was happening was believers were dying. like we know about Stephen and others. And then the question was, what happens to them? Because the idea was that Christ was going to come back. So what happens to these believers? And so Paul is addressing that. And he says, well, I want to talk about those people who have died so you don't grieve. We believe Jesus was raised. So we're going to believe that those people who have fallen asleep will be brought from the grave so that they will be with him. And then he goes on to verse 15, for this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive until the coming of the Lord will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep, that we won't go before to be in the presence of the Lord with those who have fallen asleep. And how is that going to happen? How is it that if we're alive on earth and are changed, how do we not get to the presence of the Lord first? And the answer is, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the ruling angel, with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we which who are alive, and see, then we who are living who are left will be suddenly caught up together. So here the Thessalonians, what's going to happen to the people who have died? And Paul says, well, I'll tell you, well, we're not going to go up before they do, because the dead in Christ shall rise first. Well, now, wait a minute. Let's look at this is what, it never hit me as cleanly as it did this past week, that we will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. Well, if I'm alive, which I am, and you're alive, which you are because you're watching this video, then you won't go ahead to the presence of the Lord of those who have died. But what Paul should have said, if orthodoxy is correct, is that those who have fallen asleep are already there. He wouldn't say that, hey, don't worry about it, we're not going to go ahead of those who have fallen asleep. He would say, oh, come on, the people that have fallen asleep, they're already in the presence of the Lord. But he didn't say that. And that became very clear to me this past week. I was like, wow, that's really profound, that he would not precede. We don't precede those who have fallen asleep. So I will take time this next week and add that to the appendix on the dead being dead, because I think I didn't write that as clearly as I see it now. So that's one of the great things, when you fellowship with people who believe and push on the truth that we believe, then you move down the checkerboard. That's one of the advantages of a fellowship like this. And that having been said, let's go to where I wanted to teach this morning. Let's start in Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. And I want to teach out of Matthew 24, a couple verses. Mainly, I want to teach out of Matthew 25, but I want to show us how to get there. I think this is really important. And one of the things that I think is important for us to see is how we have to tease out the context. So here we are in Matthew chapter 24, verse 1, and Jesus was going out of the temple and going away, and his disciples came to him to draw his attention to the buildings of the temple. But he answered and said to them, you see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, in no way will even one stone be left here upon another that will not be thrown down. A couple quick things before we begin to exegete the text. That what's going on here when he says not one stone will be left here upon another, that is true. That is the situation today. There's not one single stone that's left upon another. And people point to the foundation stones that Herod built that hold the dirt in place, like the Western Wall and that kind of thing. And they say, well, those stones are on top of each other. They were not part of the buildings of the temple. If you look at the context again, that the disciples drew his attention to the buildings of the temple, not the foundation that, like, in my case, I have a house that has a little place where there's a slope, and so there's some landscape timbers holding the dirt up and keeping it from kind of sliding down. I would never consider those landscape timbers holding the dirt on which my house is built as part of the foundation of the house. That, you just wouldn't do it. And that's what's going on with the stones that hold up the dirt that make up the temple platform. They were not part of the buildings on the temple. So this prophecy was fulfilled. The disciples drew his attentions to the building of the temple. Now the question would be, why? The disciples come down for Passover. This is Passover, and of course they're following Jesus. And so the disciples are coming out, and they call his attention to the buildings of the temple. And why would they do that? Oh, sure. Yeah, the buildings of the temple were magnificent. They were huge. There wasn't anything in Galilee like the buildings that were associated with the temple proper. And then for Jesus to say, you see all these things, do you not? Truly, I say to you, in no way will even one stone be left here on another that won't be thrown down. Why is Christ talking about that? Why are the disciples bringing this up? And to understand that, really what should have happened, in my estimation anyway, is Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 and 2 should have been the last two verses of Matthew chapter 23. So we need to go back. In fact, we can go back to Matthew 23, but if we want to see a full context, we go back to when Christ entered the temple, which is in Matthew chapter 21. So we go to the Matthew chapter 21 because we're now in the last days of Christ's life. And so the spiritual intensity is heating up. And I think that's, and I could be wrong, but I think that's what I'm sensing for these days. We're on the verge. I believe that we are in the last times. I don't know how many years are left, but the fact of the matter is, if it's been 2,000 years and we've got 20 more years, we're still in those last years. And I think the spiritual intensity is heating up now, just like the spiritual intensity was heating up as it came time for Christ to be the sacrifice that would pay for the sins of mankind. And so you have Matthew chapter 21, the triumphal entry when they drew into Jerusalem. And then Christ goes into the temple area in verse 12, and he cleanses the temple. And of course, he called it a den of robbers. The Sadducees were making a very, very good income stream from the buying and selling of sacrifices at inflated prices and forcing people to change their money. I don't know if you understand how the temple worked, but the way the Sadducees set it up is when Jews came from all over the empire to the various feasts, Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, Day of Atonement, that kind of thing, that they would want to buy sacrifices, and the priests would say, well, yeah, that's nice, but you can't buy a temple sacrifice with your dirty money. You have to buy a temple sacrifice with our holy money. And that's why there were money changers, because the priests had invented this money system. It was theirs and it was holy. And if you wanted to buy a temple sacrifice, you had to buy it with their money. Well, nobody came from Greece, Rome, Turkey, Egypt, all the places these guys would come from. None of them had temple money. So you had to change money. And of course that you always lost out in the exchange. And meanwhile, the Sadducees were pocketing all this foreign money, which was great for currency. I mean, it may not have bought a lamb in the temple, but it sure paid for things outside of the temple area. So the Sadducees just had this steady stream of this basically illegal income, which Christ, that's why he called it a den of thieves, a den of robbers, because they were just stealing people blind with their system. And Christ goes in and he turns over all the money changers' tables and that kind of thing. And then he leaves the temple that day, comes back in verse 23. He came back into the temple, and the leaders challenged his authority. And so then he starts telling parables about them. So he told the parable of the two sons. He told the parable of the greedy farmers. And in verse 45, and I love this, some of the crowd probably knew what was going on. A lot of the crowd would have been ignorant and just thought, oh, these are really nice stories. But the priests, who are at least evilly spiritually sensitive, if not godly spiritually sensitive, it says, verse 45, when the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, they knew he was speaking about them. So Christ was inventing these parables and talking about the church leaders in them. And they figured that right out. And so chapter 22, he tells the parable of the wedding feast, which is also about the leaders. And so then they've had enough. And so they, starting in verse 15, they try to throw a trap at him about paying taxes. Then they try to throw a trap at him about the resurrection. Then they throw a trap at him about the greatest command, starting in 22, verse 34. And then Jesus basically shuts them up with a question about the Son of David that they can't answer. And you get into 23, and then Jesus Christ boldly, and this is an important piece for you and I to meditate on, because in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus Christ boldly talks about the leadership of the temple. He just boldly exposes them as frauds. He says, you need to obey them. They say things and they don't do them, and they tie up loads that are heavy. And Christ begins to talk about the leadership. And I think that's a responsibility of Christian leaders, that we need to be honest with people about what's going on, which means that we need to be in the know. And right now, for example, if you're going to be in the know, you're not going to get there by the major news networks. They are bought and paid for. They do not they do not let you know the truth of what's going on behind the scenes. Some of the facts, yes, but they don't really let you know what the motivations are and what's happening, even though these things can be discovered in alternate news sources. And it's up to Christians and then Christian leaders to talk to people about that. Christ certainly did. And we have that responsibility also. Then, and I love this too, because Christ not only talked to the people about the leaders, but then he challenged the leaders themselves, and he pronounced a series of woes on the leaders, starting in verse 13 and going all the way down to verse 36. It wasn't pretty. Verse 33, for example, snakes, you offspring of vipers, how can you escape the judgment of Gehenna? Which of course they won't. They will be thrown in the fire and expunged from existence, for their unbelief and that kind of thing. Then Christ, and this is why, we started in 24:1, and I said 24:1 and 2 would better end chapter 23 than start chapter 24. And here's why. Verse 37, Christ says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, she who keeps on killing the prophets and stoning the ones who have been sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children in the same way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. And we've seen in other teachings the Jerusalemites and the Israelites, and certainly the religious leaders, were very ungodly, rejected the things of God. And then, so in verse 38, Christ says, look, your house is left to you desolate. Now he'd been teaching, he'd spoken to the, he'd spoken to the crowds, he'd spoken to the religious leaders, and and we also know his disciples were right there. So when he's saying this, he's got a blend in front of him. He's got his disciples who have been following him. He's got the religious leaders who are looking for anything they can grab onto to condemn him and arrest him. And you've got the crowd, and some of them sort of know what's going on, but for the most part, people don't know what's going on. And in verse 38, he says, look, your house is left to you desolate. Now, the religious leaders would just see that as just an empty statement, baseless, no facts behind it. The disciples would be confused by this, because if that's where, Christ is inside the temple when he's saying this. So if you think about what that was like, what it was like to be inside the temple with the huge temple complex. So let me share my screen real quick. And share the screen. And so here is, if you're standing on the Mount of Olives, get a little, actually kind of in a helicopter over the Mount of Olives, and you're looking to the west. This is looking from east to west. North is this way and south is this way. And here is the whole temple. And this entire complex, you can see this huge wall here, and there's a wall like it on the other side, and it's holding up the dirt. If you can see, this is the Kidron Valley down here. There's a very steep slope. And what Herod had to do was he had to build this huge wall and encase the dirt, because he went from Solomon's temple, and Nehemiah's temple was a little building approximately here. And basically then the ground sloped down on all sides. And Herod, what he did is he built these huge walls and then brought in the dirt, or captured the dirt that was there. This enclosure is 37 acres. I mean, it's gigantic. I mean, it's absolutely huge. So this is a 37-acre enclosure. You have the royal stoa down here. You had porticos on all four sides. You see the pillars and a very wide area under there where people could get out of the sun, be in the shade. You had little buildings associated with the temple, and they were all built, out of magnificent, I'm going to stop sharing. They were all built, out of magnificent stones, and they were huge, nothing like this in Galilee. And the temple, this is Passover season. The temple would have been filled with people from all over the Jewish world who were there. They were excited to be there. They wanted to worship. They wanted to be part of the temple. That's why they were buying animals, even in inflated, unfair prices, so they could offer them. And so the temple, to the disciples, it looked like a happening place. And then remember, this is before Christ's arrest even. This is even before the Last Supper. So do the disciples know Christ is going to die? No, they don't. Do they believe he's going to be raised from the dead? No, because they don't know he's going to die. Do they believe he's going to ascend? No, they don't know anything about the ascension. What do they think Christ is going to do? They're kind of waiting around for, okay, at some point here, Christ is all of a sudden going to kind of pull off his shirt, and we'll see the big red Superman S underneath, and he's going to organize, and angels are going to come down, and just like the prophecies say, and we're going to kick the Romans out of here, and Christ is going to take over, and it's just going to be wonderful. And that's what they were waiting for. And then Christ says, your house is left to you desolate. And you can just see the disciples going, how does that fit in? What's the desolate part? And like I say, the religious leaders just thought he was a wacko, and the crowds were confused all the time anyway. But here the disciples are just like, we don't get this. What's the situation here? What do you mean your house has left you desolate? And if we understand that, then we make the leap to Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. So he's leaving, and the disciples are drawing his attention to the buildings. Look, these magnificent buildings. I thought you said it was desolate. Lord, help me out here. I'm trying to put this together with the thing being desolate and all these wonderful buildings and stuff like that. And then Christ answered them and said to them, you see all these things, do you not? Truly, I say to you, in no way will even one stone be left here on another that will not be thrown down. And that would be incredibly confusing to the disciples. They would not have been able to figure out how that was going to happen. And so they mull this over, and Christ moves from the temple area down into the valley of Kidron, up onto the west slope of the Mount of Olives, overlooking the temple area, like we just saw in the picture. And so verse 3 says, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Now the religious leaders aren't there, the crowds aren't there, it's just his disciples. And they said, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so that's it. It's very important to see that connection between the end of 23 and the start of 24. And that's how we then launch into chapter 24. And so here's the question. When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And now the rest of chapter 24 and all of chapter 25 are the answer to that single question. And it's very confusing that Jesus Christ, it's very confusing that the people who put in chapter 25 when they did, because just in the natural reading of the chapters, you get the question, you get through chapter 24, you start chapter 25, you think the question's over. It's not. And that then becomes very, very important. So then if we go to Matthew chapter 25, now we saw in Matthew 21, 22, Christ was telling parables. And so here he's continuing that same motif. In the temple in Matthew 21 and 22, he was with the general crowd and the religious leaders, and he was teaching and then telling parables to them. And here he's teaching through Matthew chapter 24, and then he stops and he tells a parable here in Matthew 25. And he tells two parables, and they make two separate points. And Matthew, the first one makes the point about there's going to be a time when salvation is no longer available. In other words, if you haven't been saved by that time, it's not going to happen. And then he makes a parable about using your talents, using your gifts, and he makes that in terms of being given money and what do you do with it. And so I'd like to start, I want to just cover real briefly, well, not so briefly, but I want to cover Matthew chapter 25 and talk about these two parables because they're important, I think, today for what we're dealing with. And he starts out in verse 1, he says, at that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins. Now in Matthew 24, remember, he was expounding about the end of the age and how the Son of Man was going to come. In Matthew chapter 24, the Son of Man's going to come from the heavens. There's going to be great signs, and he'll come with all his angels and that kind of thing. And so he's saying, all right, that's going to be like 10 virgins who've taken their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now, this is one of the reasons that I love the commentary. I love understanding and explaining this thing, and people that read and study and have a notebook or jot notes for themselves, because there's a really cool, maybe sobering mini lesson buried in this first verse. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who, having taken their lamps, went out to meet the bridegroom. We learn that 10 of these virgins, or 5 of these 10 virgins are foolish. They are stupid. The Greek word moros can mean foolish, can mean stupid. We'll get into that in a minute. And 5 of them are phronemos. They use their thoughts. They're sensible. It's translated wise in most versions. It's not the standard word for wise, which is sophos, sophos. But it means they think, they use their brains. They're sensible is the translation of many of the new modern versions. Well, okay, we have these 10 young women who are going to be held accountable before the Lord for how they have behaved, how they have acted before God, and whether they've been godly or ungodly, and how old are they? I think that we today in our modern culture, we hear about 10 virgins and they're waiting around at midnight and stuff like that. And we may see girls in our minds, your mind's eye, you draw kind of a picture of this as you're reading. We may see girls in their young 20s or something like that. Girls in the biblical culture were married usually almost always between 12 and 14. If you had a 14-year-old girl that wasn't married, then it was kind of like the big fat Greek wedding thing where the father looks at his daughter and says, "You're old." And you want to get those girls married off when they're young. 12 to 14 was very, very standard. And so when it says the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who have taken their lamps, we're looking at 12 to 14-year-old girls. And so there's a message here about age and responsibility, because the adversary has worked very hard in our culture to where people just really honestly don't, they aren't pressed to take responsibility for their life till they are in their 20s. You know, and we just kind of talk about, yeah, teenagers are fools. Teenagers do all kinds of crazy and wild things. You can't expect teenagers to be responsible. That's not the message of the Bible. That's the message of the devil. So we don't challenge our young people. And granted, it's tough to go against the culture, but God is acultural. You know, God, yes, he looks on the heart, but there's a mini lesson here to parents that we need to educate our young ones while they're still young, because they are responsible. And so here are these 10 virgins. They've taken their lamps. They went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were sensible. And you cannot do in English what the Greek word does, because the Greek word for foolish, moros, it does mean foolish or stupid. Most of the lexicons will give both definitions, foolish or stupid, but there's a whole flip side to the meaning of moros that's included here that's very difficult, if maybe even impossible, to include in the translation, and that is ungodly or impious. Because the people in the culture who were ungodly were considered moros. So when we have these 5 girls and they have not prepared themselves for the timing of the end, they have not prepared themselves to meet the Lord. You and I might think of it as they have not prepared themselves for Judgment Day. And are they foolish? Yes. But the chances are that equally blended with that foolishness is an ungodliness. And that's why they have refused to get prepared. In the parable, there's 2 sets of 5, and there's 5 girls that are sensible, and they've prepared for Judgment Day, if you will. They've prepared for the fact that this age is coming to an end. And then there are 5 that are just, you know, they're ungodly. They don't care. You know, yes, they're foolish, but I think more to the point in Christ's parable, they're ungodly. And then it says, verse 3, for the foolish ones, when they took their lamps, did not take oil with them. Well, who in the world wouldn't take oil with a lamp? You see, you have to make all kinds of assumptions like, oh, well, this won't take very long. I don't need to bring anything. Besides, you know, it's a long way to the oil dealers, and I don't want to make that walk, and blah-de, blah-de, blah. And you can come up with all kinds of reasons that they didn't take oil with them. And I ought to say as well that in the parable, the thing about the lamps and the oil, it's background information. It's nighttime, so they're lamps and oil. I know if you listen to preachers on this and you read commentaries, there's all kinds of fanciful guesses as to what the lamp is, what the oil is, what part they play. Basically, as far as I can tell, all they do is add realism to the parable. They anchor the parable in real life. It's never stated anywhere that the oil is this or the lamp is this. It just says, hey, it's dark outside. They had lamps, they had oil. That made sense. So they didn't take oil with them. Now, verse 4, the sensible ones took oil in flasks with their lamps, and that would make sense. See, the ones who thought through life, the sensible ones, the ones who thought. And that's what we're encouraging people to do. Think about the fact that your life, however long or short, your life will end. There will be a day of judgment. And Jeff Tyler once taught about living with the end in mind. You know, very powerful teaching. And, you know, we live with the day of judgment in mind. Absolutely. And that's huge. And I think that's going on here. The sensible ones took oil. Verse 5, now while the bridegroom was a long time in coming, they all became drowsy and began to sleep. Now, this is part of Christ's parable, and put yourself in the disciples' position. Do they think the bridegroom is going to be a long time in coming? No. They think the bridegroom is right there. Matthew 16, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. It's like this was a parable, and to them, they're like, you know, I don't know why Christ is mentioning about a long time in coming. I mean, here he is right here. And then he's going to get his army together, right? And he's going to conquer the earth together, right? I mean, it's what's the part of why did he put this thing about a long time in coming in the parable? And they wouldn't understand it at this point. They didn't even know he was going to be crucified, much less be raised and ascend and be gone. They didn't have any idea about that. So Christ is saying that, well, the bridegroom's taking a long time to come. And they're just like, yeah, part of the parable. They didn't understand it. What's interesting is that when Matthew wrote his gospel, which I believe occurred sometime in the 50s, by then people reading the gospel of Matthew would go, wait, was that in, did Christ say that in the parable? I wonder how long a long time is to him. So actually this would mean more to you and me and more to the people who received the gospel of Matthew probably in the 50s than it did to the disciples. The disciples at the time of Christ, when Christ was actually telling the parable, had no idea what Christ meant when he talked about delaying. That didn't make any sense to them. So, but in any case, he was a long time in coming. And then verse 6, at midnight, there was a shout, look, the bridegroom, go out to meet him. Verse 7, then all those virgins awoke and trimmed their lamps. Verse 8, and the foolish ones said to the sensible ones, give us some of your oil, for the lamps are going out. But the sensible ones answered, saying, no, lest there will not be enough for you and us too. Go instead to the dealers and buy some for yourselves. And in parables, very often you kind of have to deviate from real life a little bit. And this is one of those places because it's midnight. And, the stores in the United States, for the most part, I imagine Ireland too, are closed at midnight. And I guarantee you the oil dealers were asleep unless they were at the wedding themselves. And so this here, go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves, would not track with real life, but it fits in the parable. In verse 10, while they were going away to buy some, the bridegroom came, and the ones who were prepared went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. And that's the, kind of the chewy caramel center, or half of the chewy caramel center of the parable, is that, the bridegroom shows up, and then if you are prepared, you go into the feast. And if you're not prepared, you don't get to go in. Because verse 11 says, later the other virgins also came, saying, Lord, Lord, open the door to us. But he answered and said, truly, I say to you, I do not know you. And so basically the ungodly ones, if you will, the foolish ones, would not be allowed into the kingdom. There is a time at which the door is going to shut. And that's one of the reasons that I think God is encouraging us so much, in the prophecies, to be bold, and that kind of stuff. And to look for the future. I really think that we need to be bold, and we're giving people a chance to get in, because there's a time coming when the door's going to be shut for Christians. The rapture will occur, and that'll be the end of it. And from then on, you're going to have to go through the tribulation. And then in the tribulation, there'll be a time you'll have a chance to stand up for the Lord during that time period, even though it'll be very dangerous, very tough. But everybody will have a chance to stand up for the Lord. And then come the Battle of Armageddon, and it's over with. And the door is shut. And so verse 13, part of the point of the parable, watch therefore, because you do not know the day nor the hour. And that's where we are today. We don't know the day or the hour. And then the second parable here, which I won't go into. I don't want to take the time to do that. But basically what it's about very quickly is people are given a talent. In this case, it's a unit of money. For you and I, a talent is your gifting. And the gifting, it's very important that we use our gift. I do want to focus on one thing here. The servants, two of the servants were given money and went out and used it to good effect for God. But the third one, verse 24, the one who'd received the one talent came and said, Lord, I knew that you were a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter. And I was afraid and I went and hid your talent in the earth. See, you have which is yours. And the Lord answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy slave, you knew where I reaped, where I have not sowed, and I gathered where I did not scatter. Now, he's saying that. The Lord is saying that, but that's not the way the Lord behaved. That was an assumption that the wicked slave made. And why is it important to understand this? Because this third slave, this wicked, lazy slave, he said, I knew you are a hard man, and so I was afraid. And I think that happens in Christendom because of the teachings in some parts of Christendom. People believe that God causes sickness, God causes cancer. If somebody dies in a car wreck, God did it. God's in control. He's making all these horrible things happen. And so people are afraid of God, and they think of God as a hard man, that he's a difficult person, that you can't tell if he's going to bless you or hurt you for his own purposes. And it's interesting that is debunked, if you will, in this parable. The Lord dealt very fairly and justly with all of the slaves. He gave them all money, seed money to start with. And the other two slaves didn't think that way. And I think part of our job is to help Christians press in to know God. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. God is a giver of all good gifts. God is a lover. It's the kindness of God that leads people to repentance. The teaching that God makes people sick, or God causes cancer, or God causes car wrecks, or whatever, all that stuff is Christian mythology. It's not true, but it makes people afraid of God. And when you're afraid of God, then a lot of times what happens is you're not bold to get things out, to get things out. It's really, really important. I think Tom Turner, I believe it was your prayer this morning, and you prayed, we're big. So Lord, reveal the evil to us. See, we need God to reveal what's going on in the world to us. Now, a lot of that's the work that we do. You've got to look on YouTube, or you've got to look on an alternative news source, or you've got to talk to somebody who knows about that kind of thing to get the truth. It's not that you're going to sit home alone on your couch and God's just going to speak to you. I mean, he could, but generally speaking, he won't. Generally speaking, what he'll do is he'll energize your mind, he'll honor your searches, and we'll find out what's going on. And the same thing is true. It's just like the state of the dead. If you've done the research to find out, no, the dead are actually dead, they're not alive in heaven, or that kind of thing. And you do the research to find out, really, I really am in control of my life. God isn't making terrible things happen to me, and therefore I'm not afraid of God. I don't believe God is a hard man who's dealing unfairly in life. I believe life is hard because Adam and Eve sinned and transferred authority to the devil. And so there's really good stuff kind of buried in these parables, and we need to really represent God well as his ambassadors, and be able to go out and explain to people how God is a good God, how God is a loving God, and explain to people that, look, there's a time period when the trumpet call is, we don't know when it is, but there's a time when the trumpet is going to blow and we're going to be gone. And if you're left on earth, you're going to have a really, really super hard time. So, now is a great time to become a Christian, and just help people understand what some of the Christian responsibilities are and what the blessings are. It was like in that prophecy that, have comfort in me, and I love what Rick's prophecy was this morning. There are many people who need to be saved. I believe that, and that God will back us up with signs, miracles, and wonders. Well, God isn't going to grab you by the back of your shirt and push you around to people. You've got to have your eyes open and be willing to stick yourself out there and pray for people and pray for signs, miracles, and wonders to really happen and hearts to change. So there's good stuff going on right now, and we are definitely players. And Christ told these parables to good effect in difficult times, and we're in difficult times now. So we can use the lessons from these parables to help us evangelize the people around us. And that's what I wanted to share this morning. And thank you so much for your attention. And God bless. And I'll just open the floor for discussion, what's going on in your lives and stuff like that.